An orc named Asina was cast out by her own brother. No clan, no destination, no strength left to go on. That was when a farmer stopped on the road and did something no human had ever done for her before, and it changed both their destinies forever. The road back to Ironwood Hearth was always the same. Dust, silence, the slow rhythm of hooves on dry earth. Adalric had ridden that path 100 times. He knew every broken fence post, every dried-up creek, every stone that caught the last light of evening wrong. After 7 years of farming the land along the Tescan River, he had learned to expect nothing from that road. Then he saw her. At first, she was just a shape against the pale sky, tall, too tall to be a child, too still to be a man. He pulled his black horse to a slower walk and narrowed his eyes. She stood at the edge of the road, as if the ground itself had grown tired of carrying her. Her emerald-green skin caught the fading sun like polished stone. She was nearly as tall as he was, and Adalric was not a small man. Her pointed ears drooped slightly, weighed down by exhaustion. Her clothes were torn at the edges, dusted with road grime, the leather worn thin from days of walking. He had seen that look before, not on orcs, on soldiers. It was the look of someone who had given everything just to keep moving. She did not look at him when he stopped beside her. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if stopping to acknowledge his presence would cost her the last of her strength. Her jaw was set, her hands, large and strong, hung loose at her sides, and yet, even in exhaustion, there was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that could not be stripped away. Adalric did not speak right away. He was a man who had spent enough years in the Iron Frontier campaigns to know when to stay quiet and when to act. He studied her the way he studied troubled land before planting, with patience and without judgment. She was not a threat, she was not a monster. She was a woman, exhausted, alone, and walking a road that led nowhere good after sundown. The evening wind picked up along the flat stretch of land, carrying with it the dry smell of the Tescan Valley. Somewhere behind him, the lights of Ironwood Hearth would already be flickering, the lantern above the barn door, the low glow from the kitchen window that he still lit every evening, even though no one waited inside. He looked at her again. Her eyes were sharp even now, dark, focused, watching the far end of the road with a kind of fierce stubbornness that he recognized. She was not ready to ask for help. Maybe she never had been, but she was also running out of road. Adalric adjusted his grip on the reins. His horse snorted softly, as if passing its own judgment. "The road is cruel to those who walk it alone," he said finally. "My farm is right down the road, come on." His voice was low, without command or pity. Just the plain truth of a man who had walked enough hard roads himself to know. She turned her face toward him then. It was the first time he saw her clearly. Her features were sharp but fine, high cheekbones, a straight jaw, eyes the color of deep forest shadow. She was beautiful in a way that surprised him. Not because he had never seen an orc before, but because beauty like that didn't usually look so guarded, so wounded. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she straightened her spine, all 190 centimeters of her, and said nothing. She took one step forward instead. Her leg buckled. Adalric was already moving before she hit the ground. He swung down from the saddle in a single motion and caught her by the arm. She was heavy, muscle and bone and pure stubbornness, but he had carried wounded soldiers twice her weight through mud and fire. He steadied her without flinching. "Let go," she said through her teeth. "Not yet," he answered. She pulled against him once. He held firm, not to overpower her, just enough to keep her upright until she found her footing again. "This isn't charity," he said quietly. "This is survival. Get on." She looked at his horse. She looked at him. Something behind her eyes shifted, not defeat, but calculation. The kind of decision made by someone who has survived too long to let pride finish the job that hunger started. She climbed on. He mounted behind her and turned the horse toward the farm. She sat rigid at first, her back a wall between them, every muscle tense with the effort of not needing him. The horse moved in a steady walk, and the road stretched quiet beneath them. Then, without a word, her body began to give. It happened slowly. The fever heat he had noticed when he caught her arm spread across his chest now as she leaned back against him. Not by choice, by gravity, by exhaustion, by the simple fact that a body can only hold itself up for so long before it stops listening to the mind that commands it. She said nothing, he said nothing. The lights of Ironwood Hearth came into view around the bend. The barn lantern first, then the farmhouse. Warm and plain against the darkening sky. It was not much. 4 walls, a fire, a table, but it was solid ground, and solid ground was exactly what she needed. He could feel her breathing slow as they approached. The rigid line of her shoulders eased, just slightly, just enough. When they reached the gate, he brought the horse to a stop and looked at the house. The same house he had built with his hands and filled with silence since Evelyn passed. For a moment he thought he felt something watching from the window. The old memory of a woman who used to stand there, waiting. He blinked it away. There was work to be done. He helped her down and guided her through the door. She moved carefully, one hand on the wall, unwilling to ask for more help than she was already receiving. "Sit," he said, pulling out the chair nearest the fire. She sat. He brought water, a clean cloth, and a bowl of broth from the pot that always sat low on the flames. She accepted none of it at first, just watched him move around the kitchen with the careful eyes of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that kindness came with a price. "What's your name?" he asked, setting the bowl in front of her. A pause. "Asina," she said. He nodded once. "Adalric. Used to be a soldier. Now I'm just a farmer." He pulled back from the table and moved toward the hallway. "Eat if you want. Sleep if you can. The door has no lock, but I won't come in unless you call." He left before she could respond. Outside the door, he stood in the narrow hallway for a moment and listened. He heard the scrape of the bowl being lifted from the table, then silence, then very faintly, the sound of her eating. He went back to the kitchen and sat down. When she finished eating, he guided her to the back room. She moved slowly, one hand trailing the wall of the hallway, but she moved on her own. He walked just behind her, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to give her the dignity of not needing him to. It had been Evelyn's sewing room once, small and warm, with a single window that faced the river. He had not opened that door in a long time. The air inside carried the faint smell of old cedar and something dry and sweet he could not name. The ghost of another life, still lingering in the walls. He had kept the room clean, the way a man keeps a place he cannot bear to use but cannot bring himself to let go of either. He lit the small lantern on the side table, set out a clean blanket, and stepped back. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at it the way someone looks at something they do not quite believe is meant for them. "It's yours for as long as you need it," he said. She said nothing, but she sat down on the edge of the cot slowly, and he took that as enough. He pulled the door shut behind him. Back in the kitchen, the lantern on the table burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat in his usual chair and stared at nothing in particular. He thought about the way she had looked at him back on the road, not with gratitude, not with fear, with the flat, serious eyes of someone measuring a person for the very first time and not yet sure what to find. He understood that look. He had worn it himself, in the early days of the Iron Frontier, when trust was a luxury no one could afford. Through the wall, the sound of her had gone quiet. She was asleep. Adalric looked at the window. The river glinted silver in the moonlight out past the fence line, moving slowly through the dark as it always had. The same river, the same valley. And yet the house felt different tonight, less hollow somehow, less like an empty shell that only looked like a home from the outside. Something had shifted, though he could not name it yet. It felt like the valley itself had exhaled, like some long tension had finally broken, replaced by something new and uncertain. He blew out the lantern and went to bed. Meanwhile, across the ridge, the village of Marek settled into its usual evening quiet. Lanterns dimmed in windows one by one, carts were stowed, dogs curled under porches, only one light burned late. In the neighbouring plot along the Tescan road, a stocky figure sat by his own window, watching the faint glow coming from the direction of Ironwood Hearth. Calum had noticed the horse come back with two riders. He had seen the height of the second figure. He had seen the colour of her skin in the last of the daylight. He sat with his cup and said nothing to no one, but his jaw was tight. She stayed. Not because he asked her to. He didn't. When the fever broke on the second morning and she came to the kitchen doorway, steady on her feet again, he simply handed her a mug of hot tea and pointed at the table. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at the steam rising from it for a long moment before she drank. Colour had returned to her face. The sharp lines of exhaustion were still there, but underneath them, something else was beginning to show. The shape of a person who had not yet decided whether to trust the ground she was standing on. By the third day, she was standing in the yard watching him repair the fence along the north pasture. She watched the way he worked, methodical, without wasted motion, the kind of efficiency that comes from doing a thing alone for a long time. On the fourth day, she picked up a hammer without being asked and started driving nails into the broken boards beside him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. He paid her in copper and silver, proper wages for proper work. She looked at the coins the first time with something he couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, more like the slow recognition of something she had not expected to find here. Fairness. She closed her hand around them and went back to work without a word. She had told him her name on that first night. That was all. No clan name. No history. He hadn't pushed for more. He offered what he could in return. He had told her his name and that he had been a soldier once. She had looked at his hands, the calluses, the old scars along the knuckles, and said very quietly, "Just a farmer," with something in her voice that might have been disbelief. He hadn't corrected her. She did not tell him why she had been on that road. He did not ask. But there were small things that told a story. The way she flinched when a cart passed the gate too fast. The careful way she folded her clothes at night, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. The way her eyes swept every room she entered, not with curiosity but with the old habit of checking for exits. She never sat with her back to a door. She always knew where the nearest window was. Someone had driven her out. He didn't know who. He didn't know why, but he knew the shape of exile when he saw it, had seen it on the faces of soldiers left behind, of families pushed off land that had been theirs for generations. He recognized the posture of a person who had learned to belong nowhere and had made their peace with it, and he had made a quiet decision somewhere between the fourth nail and the fifth cup of tea. Whatever she was running from would have to come through him first. The farm had plenty of work. The west barn needed new beams. The vegetable plots along the river had grown wild and thick in the years since Evelyn passed. When he had stopped caring much about anything beyond the bare minimum, there was always something that needed two sets of hands, and Asena worked without complaint, without stopping, with the focus of someone who needed the tiredness of honest labor the way other people needed sleep. She was good with her hands, better than good. She could read a broken beam the way a healer reads a wound, with calm, precise attention. She fixed things he hadn't even noticed were broken. Ironwood Hearth, for the first time in years, felt like it was waking up. Calum came on a Tuesday. Adalric heard the cart before he saw it, the uneven roll of wheels on dry road, the groan of an axle that needed grease. He looked up from the fence post he was digging and saw the stocky figure of his neighbour pulling his cart to a slow stop along the road. Calum was short, wide, and loud in the way that small people sometimes are when they want to take up more space than they have. He had lived on the neighbouring plot for as long as Adalric had been in the valley, and in all that time Adalric had never once heard the man say something that didn't carry a sharp edge underneath. Asena was on the far side of the yard, cutting timber near the woodpile. She moved with quiet efficiency, each swing deliberate. Emerald skin bright in the morning sun. Calum saw her and stopped. "Well," he called out loud enough to carry across the whole yard. "The veteran's gone and started collecting green animals now, has he?" Asena did not stop swinging, but her shoulders went tight. "Calum," Adalric said flatly, "I'm just saying what everyone in Marek is already thinking," the man continued, leaning forward on his cart with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't know what you owe these creatures, but it can't be worth the reputation." Adalric set down his shovel and looked at his neighbour with the same expression he had used on dishonest merchants and cowardly officers for 30 years. The calm, flat look of a man who had run out of patience, but not yet run out of restraint. "Move along," he said. Calum laughed and snapped the reins. The cart rattled forward. In the yard, Asena had gone still. She stood with the axe in her hands, not moving, her back to the road. Adalric watched her for a moment. He could see the tension in her spine, the way her jaw set. She didn't say anything when he came to stand beside her. She just started splitting wood again, each strike harder than the last. He picked up his own tools and went back to work, without comment. But that evening, after supper, he watched her sit at the kitchen table and stare at the flame of the lantern for a long time. She wasn't angry. She was tired in the way that had nothing to do with the day's labour. He had seen that tiredness before. It was the weight of being looked at wrong for so long that you started to wonder if the world was right about you. It happened 3 more times that week. Each time Calum passed, he found something new to say. Nothing loud enough to be a clear threat, nothing so direct that it demanded an immediate answer. Just the constant grinding kind of cruelty that works by accumulation. A word here, a laugh there, always directed at Asena, always when he thought Adalric wasn't close enough to hear. But Adalric heard. He heard it from the far end of the north fence. He heard it from inside the barn, through the gaps in the old wood planks. He heard it in the way Asena's movements changed after each pass, a little slower, a little more contained, as if she was pulling herself inward to make herself a smaller target. He said nothing to her about it. He did not want to make her feel watched, or worse, pitied. But he watched and he weighed, and the weight was building. On the 4th day, Asena came to find him in the barn while he was repairing a broken yoke. She stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind her, and she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. The light caught the emerald of her skin and made it glow, but her expression was flat, careful. The face she put on when she had already decided something and was only looking for the right words. "I should go," she said. He kept working. "Why?" "Because I'm making your life harder." She crossed her arms. And even in that posture, arms tight, jaw set, she could not hide the way her voice pulled just slightly at the edges. "Your reputation in Marek, the things he says, people talk. People always talk. Adalric." The way she said his name, flat, deliberate, with the patience of someone who had explained a hard thing before and was preparing to explain it again, made him stop. He set down the yoke and turned to face her. She met his eyes steadily, the way she always did. No flinching, no looking away, but he could read the cost of it now. The effort she put into standing straight when the world kept pushing down, the years of practice in that posture. "You're not a burden," he said, "and you're not a problem I'm embarrassed by." She said nothing. "You work this land fairly. You cause no trouble. You earn what you're paid." He paused, choosing his next words with the same care he chose everything. "And if he opens his mouth again, you have my full word. You can answer him however you see fit." She looked at him for a long time. The barn was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, the Tescan River moved through its banks, indifferent and steady. A horse shifted its weight in the stall at the far end. "However I see fit," she repeated. "Yes." Something changed in her face. Not relief exactly, more like the slow return of something that had been taken from her a long time ago. The set of her shoulders eased just a fraction. She nodded once, a small, clean movement, like a decision being sealed, then went back out into the yard. Adalric watched her go. Then he picked up the yoke and went back to work. The next morning, Calum came back. He pulled his cart to the usual stop along the road, leaned on the rail with his usual grin, and called out with his usual ease, "Still here, green thing? Didn't think a charity case would last this long." Adalric was at the barn door. He crossed his arms and said nothing. He had positioned himself there deliberately, not to intervene, but to witness. He had given his word. He intended to keep it. Asena was near the woodpile. She had been splitting logs since before sunrise, working with the quiet intensity she brought to everything. At the sound of Calum's voice, she stopped mid-swing. She set the axe down. She turned slowly and walked toward the road with the calm, measured steps of someone who had made a decision and was simply carrying it out. No hurry, no anger showing on her face, just the focused stillness of a person who had finally run out of patience and found, at the bottom of it, something very clear. Calum's grin held for a moment. Then it flickered. He looked at her full height, 190 centimeters of muscle, emerald skin bright in the morning light, pointed ears level and still, and something behind his eyes shifted. He opened his mouth anyway, the way men like him always do, because stopping had never been a habit. She stopped directly in front of his cart. She looked down at him with the flat, steady expression of someone who was done flinching, done stepping aside, done making herself small so the world would find her easier to ignore. She reached out, gripped the front of his vest with one hand, and lifted him clear off the cart seat. He yelped, a short, undignified sound that startled his own horse. "I do not want trouble," she said. Her voice was low and completely level. "I'm doing well here. And if you say one more word about me or this farm, I will not be this polite again." She set him back down. He scrambled to find his seat, hat knocked sideways, face pale as old ash, hands moving too fast over the reins. The horse tossed its head and stamped, feeling the sudden spike of fear in the man who held its lead. Adalric, still leaning against the barn door, said nothing. He simply watched, steady, present, exactly as he had promised he would be. Calum looked from Asena to Adalric and back again. He searched the farmer's face for some signal, a frown, a word, anything that suggested this had gone too far. That order would be restored, that the old familiar balance would return. There was nothing. Adalric's face was as still as stone, not approving, not disapproving, just a witness to every word of it. With shaking hands, Calum gathered his reins and drove away without another word. In the yard, Asena stood still for a moment. She breathed slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders the way water drains from a tilted cup. Then she went back to the woodpile, picked up the axe, and continued splitting logs as if nothing had happened. Adalric waited until she had her back to him before he let the corner of his mouth move. By afternoon, the story had already reached Marek. Calum had gotten there first, and the version he told was nothing like what had happened. He sat in the tavern, red-faced and trembling with rehearsed indignation, and told anyone who would listen that he had been attacked without warning, unprovoked, without cause, by the orc that the old veteran was keeping at Ironwood Hearth. He told it with the conviction of a man who had practiced the story enough times on the ride over to almost believe it himself. People listened, some nodded, a few exchanged glances. 3 men came that evening. Adalric saw them coming up the road from the porch. 3 figures moving with the stiff, purposeful gait of people who had been worked up by someone else's account of events and had not yet had time to cool down. He recognized 2 of them, decent men both, farmers like him, the kind of men who would act on a lie, not out of cruelty, but out of the honest mistake of trusting the first voice they heard. He stood up slowly from his chair. He had his coat on, his hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man who was not afraid, but was also not looking for a fight. Asena came to stand beside him without a word. He said nothing to her about going inside. She had earned her place on that porch. They stood together and waited while the 3 men came up the road and stopped at the gate. The evening light was fading behind the ridge. The Tescan River murmured in the near distance. A lantern swayed gently on its hook above the barn door. "We heard there was trouble," the first man said. His voice was careful, not threatening, but carrying the weight of someone who had been told they ought to be. "There was trouble," Adalric said, "but not the kind Calum described." He stepped off the porch and walked to the fence, unhurried, the way he did everything. "I was here. I saw all of it. He has come to this property 4 times this week to insult the woman who works here. She warned him once. He came back and did it again." He let that sit for a moment, long enough for the men to hold it. "She defended herself from daily insults. That is all that happened." He looked at each of them in turn, steady and without heat. "Calum is the only aggressor. He came here to provoke, and he found exactly what he was looking for." The 3 men exchanged looks. They knew Adalric. Every man in that valley knew him, knew his record from the Iron Frontier, knew that he had never once been found on the wrong side of a fair account. In 30 years, he had never raised his voice to be believed. He had never needed to. The weight of the silence shifted. The first man looked down at his boots. Then he looked back up at Adalric, then at Asena standing behind him on the porch, tall, still, watching them with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to wait for the world to catch up to the truth. "Right," he said quietly. They left before dark. The next morning, the whole village of Marek heard the rest of the story, not from Adalric, but from the men who had come to his gate the evening before. They spread it simply and without drama, the way honest people share what they saw. By midday, the mood in Marek had shifted. A few of the older residents found Calum at his usual spot and said what had been building for years. "You insulted a working woman on a man's property 4 days running," one of them told him. "You lied to us about what happened, and now you want us to waste our evenings on your quarrels?" Another shook his head. "If you keep this up, the village will deal with it ourselves." Calum said nothing. By the following morning his cart was loaded. No ceremony, no farewell. He moved it himself, piece by piece, down the road and over the ridge until the sound of those groaning wheels faded and was gone. At Ironwood Hearth, neither Adalric nor Asena said much about it. They went back to work. Beams to set, soil to turn along the Tescan, the slow and honest rhythm of the farm. The valley felt different without the tension Calum had dragged behind him like a chain. Days passed. One evening, the sky above the river burned amber and gold as the sun went down behind the ridge. Asena was standing at the edge of the field, watching the light move across the water. Adalric came to stand beside her. "You know," he said after a moment, "the best thing that happened to me in the last 7 years was you crossing my path on that road." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'm not leaving, not out of duty, not out of gratitude." She turned to look at him. "I want to stay. This is the first ground I've stood on that felt like mine." He looked at her. Tall, strong, and more at peace in that moment than she had looked in all the weeks since he found her. The emerald of her skin caught the last light like a rare stone set into the living earth of the valley. He stepped closer, respecting the space between them as he always had. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, "because I think it's time I called you what you truly are." He looked at her steadily. "My lady." The words were simple, quiet, But they landed with the weight of something that had been earned, not given. Asina held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. Full and unhidden, the first real smile he had ever seen from her. And in the fading light above Ironwood Hearth, two giants stood side by side on the banks of the Tescan River, and the land around them was still. Not the stillness of emptiness, the stillness of something finally whole. The story of the veteran and the emerald-skinned noble orc became the quiet legend of that valley. Proof that honor is not measured by blood or color, but by the choice to stand between someone and the world's cruelty again and again until the world gives way. They stayed, they worked, they built, and the Tescan Valley in time learned to call it what it was: justice, planted by hand, and grown into something that would last. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.